Corrupt officers publicly harass an elderly black man at an upscale restaurant, ridiculing him for simply existing in the space. As the tension escalates, a crowd watches quietly, too scared to step in. Just as it seems the situation will spiral out of control, an unlikely hero emerges. Dwayne Johnson, renowned for his on-screen power, rises, positioning himself in front of the elderly man, demanding accountability. What unfolds next will change the course of everything. The officers, taken aback and rattled, now face a force far greater than they could have ever imagined. Before we continue with the full story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. It was a serene Friday evening at a high-end restaurant where the sound of fine china clinking and quiet conversations filled the atmosphere. Among the guests was Mr. James Walker, an elderly black man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, his silver hair neatly combed. James was no stranger to luxury. After decades of hard work, he had built a successful business empire and was finally reaping the rewards. That night, his choice was simple: a peaceful dinner to celebrate his accomplishments and some new ventures. However, unbeknownst to him, his presence in the upscale establishment had attracted the attention of two off-duty officers. They were seated at a nearby table, their low voices barely rising above the hum of other diners. The officers exchanged glances, an unspoken air of judgment hanging between them. It wasn't the man himself, but rather the color of his skin that seemed to unsettle them. As the evening continued, their whispered remarks became more audible, their laughter more biting. One officer muttered, "How could someone like him afford a place like this?" The other nodded, clearly assuming James had no business being in such a luxurious setting. Their eyes tracked him around the room, their irritation growing with every passing moment. The tension in the room became thick as the officers' unease morphed into open hostility. They cast a glance toward the restaurant's manager, Sarah, a young woman known for her calm professionalism and her knack for handling delicate situations. But for now, there was no need for her intervention. Yet. Suddenly, one officer stood up and walked over to James's table. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern, unreadable expression. The elderly man looked up, his face showing a brief flash of confusion. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone commanding. "Is everything all right here?" James raised an eyebrow, unsure of the officer's intent. "Yes, everything is fine," James answered, maintaining a calm demeanor, unaware of the tension building. "Good," the officer replied with a slight smirk. "Just making sure you're not stirring up trouble. We don't want any issues tonight." His voice carried a mix of superiority and suspicion that James could sense, despite the officer's attempt at politeness. James felt a surge of heat in his chest. He'd encountered prejudice before, both subtle and overt. But this was different. There was no justification for it. He had every right to be there. Before he could say anything, the second officer joined the first, standing behind him. They exchanged a look, and without warning, one of them shoved James's plate, sending food spilling across the table. The room fell silent. Ella's eyes darted nervously between James and the two officers, her hands frozen around her glass of wine. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. It was as though the very air in the room had thickened, the tension pressing down on everyone. The diners around them remained still, almost as if afraid to get involved, unsure whether it was their place to say anything or simply unwilling to get caught in the middle of a brewing storm. Ella had always been the type of person who stood up for what was right. Growing up in a small town, she had seen her fair share of injustice. Small, everyday instances of discrimination that people often shrugged off. But this was something different. This wasn't an offhand comment or an uncomfortable glance. This was real, overt, and violent in its implication. The officer's actions felt deliberate, calculated even. James, meanwhile, had remained remarkably calm. Despite the rude and offensive behavior, he sat there with an air of quiet dignity. But even the most composed individuals have limits, and Ella could see that James's patience was beginning to wear thin. "You're out of line," James finally said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "There's no need for this." The first officer, who had been pushing around James's plate, let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, you think you're in the right here?" he sneered. "What are you even doing in a place like this? This is a restaurant for people who belong, not people like you." The words stung like a slap, and Ella's blood began to boil. It wasn't just the tone of the officer's voice, but the words themselves, which dripped with years of embedded prejudice. She had seen it all too often. Racism disguised as superiority, as though it were natural, a given. But this was different. It was too obvious, too blatant. She couldn't sit quietly any longer. "That's enough," Ella suddenly blurted out, her voice trembling with both fury and fear. The officer turned slowly, his face darkening. "What did you say?" Ella's heart pounded, but her sense of right and wrong had overtaken her fear. "You don't get to speak to him like that. Not here, not anywhere." She stood up, her voice gaining strength. "You don't get to disrespect him because of the color of his skin." There was a brief silence as the officer studied her, his expression shifting from condescension to irritation. The other officer, who had been standing quietly behind the first, stepped forward, his posture aggressive. The tension was now palpable in the room, and Ella could feel the eyes of every diner turning toward her. A few whispered, their eyes wide, but no one dared to intervene. The entire atmosphere had shifted into something dark and uncomfortable. The restaurant's manager, Sarah, had been watching the scene unfold from behind the bar. Her face was pale, and she could tell that if this escalated any further, it would get out of control. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but never anything like this. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Sarah asked, walking quickly toward the table. She could feel the tension in the air, and her instincts told her that a confrontation between an off-duty officer and a diner, especially one involving racial prejudice, was not something she could let slide. But the officers didn't respond to her. Instead, they just stood there, looking at Ella, then James. The older man's eyes, which had been hard with patience and resolve, flicked to Ella for a brief moment. His expression softened, though only slightly. "Let it go, miss," he said quietly. "They're not worth it." His voice held a calm authority, a deep understanding that only someone who had endured years of similar insults could possess. Ella shook her head, stubbornness rising in her chest. "Number. This isn't right. You shouldn't have to let it go." Before she could say anything else, the door to the restaurant swung open with a dramatic bang, drawing everyone's attention. A tall figure stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders and commanding presence instantly recognizable. Dwayne Johnson. He had been eating at a nearby table, keeping a low profile as usual. But the moment he saw the commotion and heard the racial slurs, he stood up. His frame seemed to fill the entire space between the two tables, and for a brief moment, the restaurant fell silent. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. Dwayne Johnson was here, and he was walking toward them with a look of determination in his eyes. The officers immediately stiffened, and for the first time since this entire debacle started, they seemed unsure of themselves. Dwayne was a man known not only for his size and strength, but for his reputation as an advocate for justice. His presence alone commanded respect. He stepped in front of James, blocking the officer's view. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Dwayne's voice was calm but authoritative, a sharp contrast to the hostility in the officer's demeanor. One of the officers looked up at Dwayne and scoffed, trying to regain control. "This has nothing to do with you," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Actually, it does," Dwayne said with a cool smile. "Because what you're doing right now, it's wrong, and I can't let it slide." The tension in the room was unbearable as the officers hesitated. James had been a silent victim until now, but Dwayne's arrival had thrown the balance into disarray. The power dynamics were shifting rapidly, and Ella could see the officers struggling to hold on to their superiority, knowing full well that the situation was spiraling out of their control. The quiet tension was slowly giving way to the realization that things were about to change. How would the officers respond to Dwayne's bold intervention? Would they retreat, or was this about to become a standoff that none of them would forget? The restaurant was now holding its breath, as though the very air was waiting for a single word to break the silence. Dwayne Johnson stood with his arms crossed, a calm but resolute figure blocking the officers from further intimidating James. His gaze was unwavering, directed at the two men who had been disrespecting the elderly man. The officers seemed to exchange glances, unsure of how to respond. The one who had spoken earlier, the one who had first approached James's table, was now visibly rattled. Ella had become an advocate for racial justice, her once quiet life now filled with speaking engagements and public appearances. She had never imagined that one night could change the course of her life. But there she was, standing in front of crowds, using her voice to make a difference. And, as much as she had expected to be a passive participant in the world of activism, she quickly realized that her story mattered. Her actions had sparked a much-needed conversation about how far society still had to go. James, too, had found new purpose. He had started to speak publicly about his experiences with racial profiling, hoping to inspire other people who had been through similar situations to find their voice. His words were measured but impactful, and every time he spoke, he felt a little more free. The years of silence were behind him. The truth was, he had always known that the fight for equality didn't end with one confrontation, one apology. But he also knew that every time he shared his story, he helped build the momentum for something bigger. Dwayne Johnson, for his part, had continued to use his platform to push for justice. He had launched several initiatives, collaborating with nonprofits and grassroots organizations working to dismantle racial prejudice. His message was simple. The fight for equality wasn't just about one man, one woman, or one incident. It was about the collective struggle of millions, and it would require everyone's participation to change the system. For Dwayne, it wasn't about the accolades or the praise. It was about knowing that, in his own way, he had helped create a turning point. The work wasn't over, but every person who spoke out, every person who stood up, every person who refused to stay silent, each one of them was a step closer to a world where prejudice could no longer thrive in the shadows. And as for Ella and James, they kept in touch. Their friendship had formed from a single, life-altering moment. They knew they had witnessed something rare, a spark of hope in the face of adversity. It wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was about what had been set into motion. In the end, the story wasn't just about the racist officers who had tried to belittle a man based on his skin color. It was about the people who had stood up, who had pushed back against prejudice and refused to let it go unchallenged. And the most powerful part of the story was that their collective effort had proved something to the world. The fight for justice was a never-ending process, but it was worth it. Karma, in its own way, had a way of catching up, and when it did, it had a funny way of showing just who was in the wrong. If you enjoyed the story of James and how Dwayne Johnson's bold intervention helped confront prejudice head-on, then make sure not to miss the next story. Click here to watch it and discover more moments of courage and change that can inspire us all to stand up for what's right. Thanks for watching, and remember, real change begins with each one of us. His bravado from before had diminished, replaced by the realization that Dwayne wasn't just a celebrity. He was a man who stood for something far greater than his fame. "Look," the officer said, trying to recover, his voice slightly strained. "This doesn't concern you. We're just doing our job." But even he knew the words felt weak, unconvincing. Dwayne didn't flinch. "Number." "This does concern me," he replied, his voice steady, every word carrying the weight of someone who had faced adversity and injustice in his own life. "You don't get to treat someone like that. Not in my presence, not in anyone's." James sat silently, his face a mix of stoic resignation and surprise. He hadn't expected this, especially not from a stranger. But seeing someone step in, someone willing to stand up to the system of prejudice and inequality that he had been enduring for decades, brought a warmth to his chest. Ella, standing by now, felt her heart race with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She had only spoken out because she couldn't bear seeing someone else suffer. But Dwayne Johnson, with his strength and platform, was amplifying her voice in a way she never could have dreamed of. The entire restaurant had become a witness to this moment, and Ella knew that whatever happened next would reverberate beyond these walls. The second officer, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his face reddened with embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, clearly annoyed by Dwayne's interference. He looked around the room at the other diners, who were now murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Let's just get out of here," he muttered under his breath. But Dwayne wasn't ready to let them off that easily. "Not so fast," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're not going to walk away from this. You have to understand the gravity of what you've done. You can't treat people like that because of their skin color, and you certainly don't get to push someone around because you think you can." The officers looked at each other again, but this time they were shaken. Dwayne wasn't just a physical presence in the room. He was a voice for the people who couldn't speak up, and he wasn't backing down. "You need to apologize," Dwayne said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "Not just to him," he pointed toward James, "but to everyone who's ever been treated this way. If you're going to be in this world, be better than this." The first officer, whose face had become flushed with embarrassment, opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. He knew he couldn't fight the weight of Dwayne's words. Instead, he hung his head in shame. The second officer, realizing they had lost control of the situation, muttered an inaudible apology and began to turn toward the door. As they walked away, the room seemed to exhale. People began to murmur in disbelief, some nodding in agreement with Dwayne's actions, while others simply looked relieved that the confrontation had come to an end. Ella turned to Dwayne, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Dwayne smiled at her, his eyes softening. "You did the right thing. Standing up for someone who's being treated unfairly is never easy, but you did it." James, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper behind it. "Thank you, both of you," he said, his eyes meeting Ella's and then Dwayne's. "You didn't have to do that, but I won't forget it." Ella Sanrio Aliviada. "It's not about remembering. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Dwayne nodded, his expression turning serious. "That's right. This moment, it's more than just a restaurant. It's a reminder of the work we all have to do. We need to keep pushing for change." The tension in the restaurant slowly began to dissipate, but the effects of what had just transpired would linger far longer than the echoes of the officer's retreating footsteps. Ella and James exchanged a few more words of gratitude, and Dwayne, ever the humble man, turned to walk back to his table, knowing that he had done his part for the night. But deep inside, he knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Racism and prejudice were systemic problems, ones that could not be erased with a single confrontation. But it was a start, a spark of change that could ignite something bigger. As Dwayne sat back down, his phone buzzed on the table. A text from his manager read, "Stay ready. The fight isn't over. Keep pushing for what's right." Dwayne's eyes glinted as he looked back toward James and Ella, two people who had not backed down when faced with injustice. They weren't just witnesses to a confrontation. They were participants in something larger. They had chosen to act. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. The night ended with a sense of unease and hope in equal measure. As the restaurant slowly emptied, the murmurs of the crowd settled into the background, and the lights flickered a little brighter. But the real work was just beginning. Would this confrontation be a turning point, a symbol of something deeper that needed to be addressed in society? Would those who witnessed it take action, or would it fade into another forgotten moment of discomfort? Only time would tell. The days following the incident at the restaurant were filled with an energy that neither Ella, James, nor Dwayne could ignore. Word had spread like wildfire, carried through social media, word of mouth, and the quiet power of shared experiences. The viral video that had been filmed by another diner in the restaurant, though it showed only the latter part of the confrontation, had been picked up by countless news outlets and social platforms. What had been an isolated moment of justice had now become a symbol of resistance, one that echoed in the hearts of many who had long been silenced by fear or indifference. Ella had never imagined that speaking up in that moment would cause such a ripple. She had been just one voice in a room full of people. Yet, somehow, her simple act of standing up against the officer's cruelty had struck a chord far beyond that single restaurant. Her phone had been ringing non-stop ever since. News outlets wanted to interview her. People from all walks of life were sending messages of support, and even activists had begun reaching out to see if she would join their campaigns to address racial injustice. She had never been the kind of person who sought attention, but she realized that, for some reason, her story had resonated with the larger fight for equality and dignity. That night, in that restaurant, she had done what others had failed to do. She had taken a stand, and now, it seemed, the world was listening. As for James, the elderly man who had been at the heart of the controversy, his life had also shifted in unexpected ways. After Dwayne's intervention, James had felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. He had spent so many years trying to avoid confrontations, to let things go for the sake of his own mental peace. But now he was filled with a quiet pride. It wasn't just that someone had stood up for him, it was that the entire world had witnessed it. James had lived through decades of discrimination, systematic, subtle, and sometimes painfully blunt. He had encountered all kinds of prejudice throughout his life, especially in business. But this moment, this intervention, felt different. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or wronged. The days after the incident saw James receiving a multitude of messages, some from old acquaintances, some from strangers, expressing their gratitude and solidarity. He had become an unexpected symbol of resilience. One evening, as James was reflecting on the events, he received a message that made his heart stop. It was from Dwayne Johnson himself. "Hey, James," the message began. "I just wanted to check in and see how you were doing after all of this. I've been following the news, and I just want you to know that I've got your back, no matter what. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." James's hands trembled as he read the message. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. In that simple note, Dwayne had made it clear that the moment in the restaurant wasn't just about standing up to a couple of prejudiced officers, it was about creating a new sense of community. James wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. But as much as James was grateful for the support, it wasn't just Dwayne's words or Ella's courage that had caused the real change. It was the way society had responded. People were beginning to talk, and conversations about racial prejudice, inequality, and justice were starting to feel less like isolated complaints and more like the collective cry for action. The moment Dwayne had stepped into that restaurant, things had shifted. It wasn't just about one celebrity taking a stand. It was about the recognition that these problems were real, and they needed to be addressed. Slowly but surely, people were starting to look inward, asking themselves what they could do to be better, to push for fairness in the small, everyday moments that often went unnoticed. Months had passed since the night at the restaurant. The media buzz had faded, but the ripple effects were still being felt. The officers involved had faced internal investigations, though the results were far less satisfying than many had hoped. While they were reprimanded, it was clear that the systemic nature of their behavior wouldn't change overnight. But the fact that their actions had been so publicly challenged had sparked something. People were paying attention.